Hey guys, this is chapter 13, Expansion, War, and Sectional Crisis, 1844 to 1860. We'll look at Manifest Destiny and its impact on slavery. We'll talk about several presidents, start with James K. Polk in 1844. We'll move on and talk about Zachary Taylor. He dies in office, so Miller Fillmore takes his place. We'll look at Franklin Pierce afterwards, and we'll finish it up with James Buchanan. So right off the top, we're going to look at Manifest Destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that whites believe that God ordained them to move from east to west, sometimes also known as moving from shining sea to shining seas. And whites came in different methods. They came by way of walking, they came through horse carriages, and they also came by railroad transportation. You notice this painting, there's a lot of light over here, and there's a lot of darkness over here. The whites saw the Native Americans in their way of life, the buffalo, as being in the dark. And so whites believe that they were moving west to enlighten the Native Americans, in part through religion, politics, and social. James K. Polk will look at this. So this is the Oregon Trail, and a lot of people are moving to the Oregon country, which is current day Oregon and part of Canada as well. Now, this is called 4440 or fight because of the longitude. You notice over here, that's the longitude 5440. And James K. Polk wanted this line to be the border of the state of Oregon. That was occupied by Britain. And Britain wanted this line to be the border of current day Oregon. So they were fighting for all this territory here. Eventually, they both reach an agreement, what becomes known as the Oregon Treaty of 1846. So what we see here is we see Americans who are settling south of the Columbian River and British that were settling north of it. So the agreement of the Oregon Treaty of 1844 was that the border was going to be the 49th parallel, and that becomes the border between current day Oregon and part of Canada, which was owned again by Britain. Now the Americans were coming to Oregon via the Oregon Trail. There it is again. This was a 2,000-mile journey. It was difficult. It had many difficulties, full of hazards, including dust storms, floodplains, diseases, being lost, and conflict with Native Americans. A lot of Americans that were coming to the Oregon, they were settling in this valley, which becomes known as the Willamette Valley. It was very, very fertile, and it produced a lot of crops. So Americans were coming here to start new because back east, they had a very rough life. So this is how the United States gets this part of the U.S., the Oregon country, in 1846 under President James K. Polk. Now, not everybody settled in Oregon. So the Oregon Trail started in Independence, Missouri, and it takes you right there. You also have the Mormon Trail in purple, and that stopped in Salt Lake City. The Oregon Trail stopped over here in the Willamette Valley. But some people were also coming to California, Northern California in particular. And you notice at this point in 1844, that was owned by Mexico. However, prior to it being owned by Mexico, it was owned by Spain. So Spanish authorities and the Catholic Church established all these missions that you see here with the purpose of converting Native Americans to the Catholic Church. After Mexico won its independence from Spain, Mexico officials took over these missions and freed over 20,000 enslaved Native Americans. So all this land now becomes part of Mexico territory. And the Mexican government gives land grants, pieces of land, about 19,000 acres of land to families and to political allies. Now, much of this land that the Mexican government was giving to its political allies and families was actually owned by Native Americans. Now, the land that was received by Mexican officials, they become known as Californios, in particular in California, obviously. So they become known as Californios. And these are people that lived in California when California was under Mexican rule. And these Californios become ranchers. They raise livestock, in particular cows. And the leather of the cows was then used to ship to the east for the purpose of making shoes, because at this point there was a huge booming shoe industry in the east. So we automatically see how the California population and resources add to the US economy immediately. So what we have here is, again, Oregon now is part of the US in 1846. However, a year before that, in 1845, the US finally agreed to annex Texas. Recall, since 1836, Southerners wanted Texas to join the Union as a slave state, but Northern politicians had rebuffed the idea. So during the 1844 presidential election, candidates were asked about what was going to happen with Texas. The Democratic candidate was James K. Polk. He was a slave owner and he favored expansion. And he promised that if he was elected president in 1844, that he would annex Texas. But he said not only Texas, but also the Oregon country. And this is how he gets the idea of 54-40 or fight. Well, after he wins the presidential election in 1844, he quickly moves to annex Texas in 1845. So by December 1845, Texas is added to the Union and Texas becomes the 28th state of the United States of America. So now that Polk got Texas in 1845 and Oregon in 1846, he is not happy. He is not satisfied, I should say. He was land hungry. So Polk now wanted northern part of Mexico, all this yellow area that you see that belonged to Mexico. And he wanted that. He saw an opportunity to agitate Mexican authorities who had suspended diplomatic relationship with the U.S. after the U.S. annexed Texas. Now, Polk had hoped for a revolution in California similar to the one in Texas in 1835. Californians were encouraged to rebel and join the U.S. And to support the rebels, Polk sent John Fremont to Northern California on a, quote, exploration, unquote, to aid those rebels. Meanwhile, John Citto was sent to Mexico to negotiate the Texas border, which was the Rio Grande according to the U.S. So this area right here in gray, that was the area that was being disputed. Americans wanted the border to be the Rio Grande right there. So they wanted Texas not only to be this part, but everything that you see in gray here. The Mexican authority says, sorry, that land belongs to us. So the Mexican authorities wanted this land, the American authorities wanted that land. Polk was not happy that Citto was unable to meet with the Mexican authorities because the Mexican authorities refused to meet with Citto. And that was Citto spelled like this. That was John Citto, sent to Mexico to negotiate that area. And because the Mexican authorities refused to hear him out, James K. Polk now sent Zachary Taylor, right here, to provoke a war in Matamoros. As Zachary Taylor enters this area, Mexican authorities fire upon him. And that's exactly what Polk wanted. He argued that Mexican troops had crossed the border, invaded the U.S., and had shed American blood on American soil. Congress quickly moved to declare war against Mexico. And it was in here in 1846, when Mexico arranged the Oregon Treaty with Britain. Polk wanted to avoid fighting two wars, one in the Oregon country and one in Mexico down here. So Taylor, after the war is declared, Taylor continues to Matamoros and he takes Matamoros in June 1846. At the same time, Fremont begins to take Northern California and what becomes known as the Bear Flag Revolt. And also Stephen Kearny, who is sent down south here, takes from Santa Fe all the way to San Diego. So by September 1847, most of this land was already part of the U.S. The year moves on and American forces start to move into the inland of Mexico. And by September 1847, Mexico City is within its reach. The U.S. government captures the city and the president was still Santa Anna. When Mexico City is captured, Santa Anna flees and a temporary government signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said a couple things. First of all, that area that Polk wanted becomes known as the Mexican Cession. After taking the Mexican Cession, Manifest Destiny is completed because now the Americans have taken from east to west, every land in between. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico surrendered the Mexican Cession. And the U.S. paid Mexico $20 million for its war losses. Immediately, the question of slavery arose. Would the Mexican Cession be free, or would slaves be allowed there? And that becomes a huge controversy. So the Mexican War ended in 1848. This is more or less right on the time that Polk is about to finish his presidency. We have a Democrat. His name is David Wilmot. He was the same political party that Polk was, the president. And this becomes known as the Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot says that there should be no slavery in the Mexican Cession, that area should be free. Now, some people join Wilmot and they create a new political party, which is known as the Free Soil Party. So after all the fighting in an extraneous regime, Polk decides not to run for re-election. And so the idea of whether this is going to become a slave state or not is still up in the air. That idea goes to Zachary Taylor. In 1848, he defeats the Democratic candidate Louis Class. Taylor died unexpectedly on July 1850, so Miller Fillmore becomes president. But before that, we see the gold rush. So gold is discovered in Sutter's Mill on January 1848. Within a year, boatloads of people unloaded in the San Francisco docks in search of wealth. And by 1849, we have over 80,000 people from all over the world that ascend in California. So California population completely skyrockets. And a lot of these 49ers lived in overcrowded, chaotic towns surrounded by gamblers, saloons, and prostitutes. Diseases like cholera and diarrhea were common killers. Plus, there was limited law and order. This kind of gives you an idea of these western towns. We also have people, men and women, who were moving west. Now, many whites were welcome, but Native Americans, Mexicans, and especially the Chinese, after they arrive as well, they are discriminated. Oftentimes, these minorities were confined to menial jobs. And as more and more Chinese arrive, Americans asked Congress to pass legislation limiting foreigners into the country. Few prospects made it rich. Most actually returned home empty-handed and humiliated. So this is again the idea of manifest destiny. All this land that you see here was actually at one point owned by Native Americans. So westward expansion took its biggest toll on Native Americans. In 1848, there were over 150,000 Native Americans in California alone. By 1861, only about 30,000 remained. In 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett proclaimed a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Native American race becomes extinct. And unfortunately, Congress did not have the Native Americans. They actually refused to give them help. And so Native Americans who were not sent to reservations and who resisted were killed by settlers who were moving west into the Oregon country or California. Entire tribes were vanished by war and diseases. Californians also suffered at the hand of these land-hungry Americans. American settlements settled on land grants of Californians. These American settlers refused to accept the legitimacy of Mexican land grants. Property owners had to prove that the land belonged to them. And after lengthy court battles and lawyer fees, many property owners were too poor to improve their land and were forced to sell their land at bargain prices to American settlers. So we see here again the population of San Francisco in particular, but this was common throughout California. It skyrocketed because people were in search of gold. In 1860, the population of California was 380,000, but by 1870, it had reached over 560 inhabitants. The population boom quickly made it possible for California to apply for statehood. And again, the slavery question came up.